Okay, A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. We're going to start a new period 4, 1800 to 1848. And our intro song was from the TV show The Jeffersons that came out back in the late 1970s. Maybe your parents or grandparents remember that show. And it relates to our main person for Chapter 11, President Thomas Jefferson. And he was definitely moving on up to the presidency, winning the election of 1800. In this first part of the video, this video is going to cover pages 210 to 218 in Chapter 11. We're going to look at the greatness, the good things, and the bad things of Jeffersonian democracy during this time period. Okay, the first section of reading is on the Federalists and the Republican mudslingers. And again, Republican, we like to call them the Democratic Republicans, so we can distinguish them from the Republican Party that comes around later in the 1850s. All right, so the election of 1800, a very, very important election in history, was between the incumbent, John Adams, who was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who's part of the Democratic Republican Party. This is the first nasty election in American history, and unfortunately we had several other nasty elections throughout our history. There was mudslinging on both sides, so basically they were kind of insulting each other and saying bad things about each other. And off to the right over here are some problems that both Adams and Jefferson faced. So for Adams, okay, there was war fever by the Federalists. Unfortunately, the quasi-war with France did cause a large debt, so that was an issue. New taxes were created to try to lower this debt because of the war. And also, probably the worst thing that happened during Adams's presidency was the creation of the Alien Sedition Acts, which unfortunately kind of went against some early amendments. But Jefferson, he also was accused of many things, and in fact, one was fathering a child with his slaves, and that actually did happen. He did father a child with a slave named Sally Heming. He was also accused of robbing a widow of her trust fund. That's an accusation, mudslinging against him. He was also accused of being an atheist from the religious North. Okay, and so Jefferson was definitely not a very religious person. In fact, he wanted a separation of religion from the government, and so that was a criticism of him. Section, the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800, and so Jefferson does win this election over Adams in the Electoral College 73 to 65, so it was very close. And the region that typically helped Jefferson and later Democratic Republicans are the West region, especially around the new state of Kentucky, and also the South regions did help him win. A little bit of a note here, Aaron Burr, who we'll talk more about later, interesting character in American history, was Jefferson's vice presidential running mate. He did help Jefferson win with perhaps some shady tactics in New York, but he does help Jefferson win. Burr did actually receive some votes for president himself. Eventually his votes do go to Jefferson. And actually Jefferson and Aaron Burr, they did actually share the same number of electoral votes. So because of this fact, it actually went to the final results actually went to the House of Representatives, and they had to decide between Aaron Burr or Thomas Jefferson. And although the Federalists did not like Jefferson, they hated Aaron Burr even more, so they did the right thing and made Jefferson the president. On a side note, and this is something you don't need to know for A-Push, but the 12th Amendment was added, which said the second place finisher to the president no longer became the vice president, but each candidate, presidential candidate, could pick their vice presidential running mate, and they would become the VP. The presidential candidate did win. And so lastly, this section is called the Revolution of 1800, and it was revolutionary because it was a peaceful transfer of power between rival groups. So there really was not any bloodshed. Although they didn't like each other, there was no bloodshed or any serious problems between the Federalists and John Adams, who did give up power, and Thomas Jefferson. Okay, the Federalist finale. John Adams was the last and only Federalist president in American history. Washington was a Federalist in belief, but he did not have it as his party. He, of course, had no party. And then the Federalist Party does die out, and they wither away from power, and they're officially done by the year 1820. And again, they no longer have a presidential winner. Some of the accomplishments of the Federalists, John Adams did keep us out of a war with Britain and France. Now, we did have the unofficial war with France, but actual declaration of war never happened, so that's a tribute to John Adams. The Federalists did sign advantageous treaties with Britain, and I put a question mark here because Jay's Treaty, I don't know how advantageous that was for America because we did give up a lot in that, but other treaties with France and Spain as well. And so the Federalists did build an enduring foundation of a new government. So they definitely deserve credit. They preserved democracy against anarchy. Think of Shays' Rebellion as anarchy, and so that didn't happen again. And it was basically a halfway house between the European past and the American future. So that's a good way to think about the Federalists. It was like a stepping stone to our democracy of today. And I would highlight this, the biggest downfall of the Federalists is they could not appeal to the common man. Okay, Okay, they're a lot of times seen as more British, perhaps in some ways, wearing the wigs. And so the Democratic Republicans, the DRs, definitely had an advantage of appealing to the common man, and so were able to win the rest of the elections against the Federalists. Next section, responsibility breeds moderation. So this is about Jefferson's inauguration. So he has a famous quote. I would highlight this quote, and this is a tribute to Jefferson. He said, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." So he's basically saying that we need to unite as a country despite our political divisions. And to his credit, Jefferson did keep many Federalist officials in public office. So he didn't have a complete overthrow of the government. He didn't remove all the Federalists, which kind of led to continuity of our government. And so the Federalist Party was actually the glue that kept the Democratic Republicans together. These people did not like the Federalists, and so that actually was basically what kept them together to agree on many issues. A little bit about Thomas Jefferson. He was an unorthodox president. He was married, but his wife passed away, so he did not have a wife while he was president. And he was forced to reverse many of his principles when he became president because he was conflicted because the president gave him enormous power, and it kind of goes against his beliefs of a states' rights leader. So he definitely had some conflict there. So basically there were two Jeffersons. One, he was a very scholarly, private citizen who was philosophized in his studies, so he was that. But he was also a harassed public official, and he realized that many of his ideas and theories weren't practical when he became president. So we like to say that he became consistently inconsistent with his beliefs. And the biggest thing that he's known for is Louisiana Purchase. And although that was a great buy for America, that really conflicted with a lot of Jefferson's ideals, and we'll get to that in the second half of Chapter 11. I did want to show this document on page 211, this political cartoon. And how is this an example of Federalist propaganda? So this is about Jefferson. So this is supposed to be Thomas Jefferson right here. And then we have the American eagle right here. And we have like divine intervention or God looking down on Jefferson. And so the Federalists used this because they were afraid that what Jefferson was going to do when he was president is it could become a lot like France. We know the French Revolution was very bloody, a lot of anarchy. And so this image right here, I don't know if you can see what that is, but that is the Constitution. It appears that Jefferson is going to burn the Constitution when he is president. This altar of fire relates to the problems of the French Revolution. And so what this is saying is that the American eagle needs to come in and to stop Jefferson from destroying the Constitution. So it's definitely Federalist propaganda against Jefferson. Okay, the next section, Jeffersonian restraint helps to further revolution. So he did use restraint. He did keep some Federalists in political power in some offices. And he also, surprisingly, does not eliminate all of the Federalist programs that he criticized, especially the Hamilton's programs, his economic programs Jefferson despised, but yet he actually kept some of them in place and didn't try to overturn them, such as the bus. The Bank of the United States was left alone. Some thought Jefferson would try to remove that. He did not. He left the tariff alone. He did assume the states' revolutionary war debt. So that was the assumption policy. However, the one thing he does get rid of is the excise tax was eliminated from Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson does lower the Alien Act back to the 5 years for citizenship, the way it was before the Alien Act of 1798. And so I think a key thing here is Jefferson's moderate response showed that a change in power need not be disastrous for the defeated group. And that's an American tradition, is that even if you lose an election, a lot of your ideas will not go away. All right, two more sections of reading. The next one is the dead clutch of judiciary. And the Judiciary Act of 1801 was created right at the end of Adams's presidency, and it did create 16 new federal judges. And among these were called the Midnight Judges, where John Adams stayed until 9 p.m., his last evening as president, to sign these appointments. So what he wanted to do, Adams, is put a bunch of Federalists in these positions, which would allow the Federalists to still have a lot of power in the government. However, the Republicans will later try to repeal this act in 1802, which is going to set the stage for a major, probably the most important Supreme Court decision in American history. We'll get to that a little bit later. But so this idea, this conflict is going to go to the judicial branch, which has typically been very weak the first 10 to 12 years of our American existence. The judicial branch was the weakest of the three. But a new person takes over. John Marshall, I love him. I love you. It's real. It's not fake. It's a real love. I love this man. He becomes the Chief Justice. He's appointed by John Adams, and he is probably the greatest Chief Justice in American history. And he actually brings so much power to the judicial branch, and he will shape it for the next 200 years. And so a common thing to say is that the Federalist Party does die out, especially by 1820. They are gone. But John Marshall, who is a Federalist in belief, is going to stay in power, the Chief Justice, for 34 years up until the 1830s. I love you. Okay, this could be the most important page of this video. It's about the Supreme Court decision, Marbury v. Madison. This is a absolute must-know and A-push. This is the first great Supreme Court case, maybe the most important of all Supreme Court decisions. And so this is kind of the details of it, that you don't have to get bogged down in the details, but I think the result of it is the most important thing. So this is what happens in Marbury v. Madison. Okay, a man named William Marbury was appointed by President Adams. He was one of the midnight judges in 1801, and he was appointed to a position, a judge position in our federal government. Now, James Madison, who was a Democratic Republican and did not like the Federalists, he was the new Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson, and he refused to confirm the appointment of Marbury. Okay, and so now we've got some serious conflict and some drama that has to be solved. And this conflict is eventually going to go to the Supreme Court and John Marshall, who's sitting there, and he has to make a ruling. Okay, what's going to happen? Will Marbury get his position as a federal judge or not? And so what the Supreme Court decides, and it was a brilliant move, is they said that the Judiciary Act of 1789, that was created right during the first Congress, the Supreme Court ruled that the Judiciary Act was ruled unconstitutional, okay? And so it said that this law does not follow the Constitution. And so the biggest result of Marbury v. Madison is the idea of judicial review, and this was created by John Marshall's Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that congressional acts or laws passed by Congress could be declared unconstitutional by the judicial branch, specifically the Supreme Court. And so this gives even more power to the judicial branch, and it really confirms the idea of checks and balances. And so the final meaning of the Constitution, to interpret the Constitution, is going to be done by the judicial branch, and especially the Supreme Court. The final section is the pacifist Jefferson turns warrior. So Thomas Jefferson originally distrusted large standing armies. He was not a fan of having big armies. He said that if our government has a bbig army, it's an invitation to dictatorships, meaning the government can use the army to overthrow the people. And so Thomas Jefferson reduces the size of the military, and that's his pacifist nature, and so he wanted a smaller army. And unfortunately, that does kind of come back and haunt us a little bit, especially as we get into the War of 1812, but that'll be later. So the first conflict for Jefferson was with pirates of the North African Barbary states, and so this is a region in northern Africa. And these people were raiding American ships and collecting protection money in the Mediterranean. So they're a nuisance to our merchant ships out by the Mediterranean, especially close to Europe. And so the conflict escalates, and the country of Tripoli in North Africa declares war on the United States, and this becomes known as the Barbary States War, or the War with Tripoli. And so again, I don't think this is a major issue that you need to know, but I think the most important thing is Jefferson's response to this international conflict. And so basically he sends the Navy into the region. Unfortunately, he did reduce the size of it, so we were still relatively weak to fight this war. And after 4 years of fighting, a peace treaty is finally signed. And Jefferson also commissions the building of 200 small gunboats called Jeff boats, and these unfortunately are not very effective in the fighting against the Barbary States countries, and it doesn't work out too well. They only had one gun, so they're pretty weak. And so I think the importance of this section is that Jefferson, who was a pacifist, reduced the size of the military, but it led us to be somewhat ineffective in our fighting with these Barbary States countries. And also our weak military will hurt us in the War of 1812 against Great Britain.